Hi, everybody. Today, I'll be talking about boom and bust cycles in self-driving and Web3 and the lessons and takeaways from those cycles. So, to introduce myself, I'm Asta. I'm a reformed self-driving engineer. I worked on a variety of autonomous robots over the last decade. What started my journey in self-driving when I was at Uber in 2016, and then was one of the first engineers at Aurora starting in 2017. Spent a lot of time thinking about data infrastructure when I was working in self-driving, and left over a year ago to build data infrastructure for Web3. So today I'm building Privy, which is a developer tool for managing user data off-chain. And I thought it'd be fun to share some of the parallels between my former life in self-driving and what I see in Web3 today. So to give a little bit of structure for the talk, I'm going to go through a bit of a walk down memory lane and talk through some of the shared history between self-driving and Web3 in terms of boom and bust cycles, and then talk through a couple of takeaways. So yeah, history as far as sort of expansion and consolidation is concerned. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme, according to this supposed Mark Twain quote. And I think one particularly interesting lens to look at history through is through the lens of the Gartner hype cycle, where we sort of see this trend in technology again and again, where there's an innovation trigger, there's an expansion of companies and projects that rise with the peak of inflated expectation, and then there's sort of this dip and consolidation phase as you enter the trough of disillusionment, and then a sort of slope of enlightenment beyond that. So let's talk about that spark. And in the case of self-driving and in Web3, it's not exactly a single spark, but it's a combination of technology innovation as well as social coordination that sort of sparks this expansion phase. So in terms of self-driving, I think the single biggest innovation is around deep learning, around the research that encouraged advances in computer vision that we'd never seen before. And for Web3, a lot of this is around the launch of Ethereum and the ERC20 standard. And I think in addition to technology innovation, the sort of less talked about spark for expansion is actually coordination or human coordination. And so in the case of self-driving, this is like the DARPA Grand Challenge, which is a government-funded initiative for a variety of projects across academia and industry to try and build a self-driving car in a competitive environment. This is regulation making self-driving street legal for the first time. And for Web3, this is standards that people agree on and coordinate around that allow for the interoperability promise of Web3. In fact, I think there's a parallel, which is that the lack of regulation is one of the reasons we've been able to run interesting new experiments in the Web3 space. And beyond that, the hype and funding and news coverage and just public interest across self-driving and Web3 are major coordination points that lead to innovation and expansion. So expansion is sparked not just by technology, but also by human coordination. So that's moving on to the expansion phase. In self-driving, so I got into self-driving in 2016, and over the course of 2016 to 2017, there was this massive explosion in self-driving companies. I'd go to CVPR, which is a computer vision conference, and it was like every company was a self-driving company. There were like 40 or 50 companies that were all trying to launch, L4, L5 self-driving. There's a huge capital influx and a ton of hype, and headlines that were, saying, oh, by the end of 2018, we're going to have fully driverless cars on the road, and Elon Musk tweeting left and right about cross-country autonomous summons working in just a couple-year time frame. And so this is me at the end of 2017, sort of peak hype of self-driving, waiting for my glorious self-driving robot-filled future. And meanwhile, there's some interesting stuff happening in Web3 as well, which is in 2017, you get this first massive mainstream awareness of Web3. Like, you couldn't have paid attention to the news and not heard about crypto. With this came the ICO boom. In particular, there was Block One's $4 billion ICO over the course of a single year, and they were completely pre-product, which is crazy to me. And over the course of 2016, you had something like 800 ICOs raising over $20 billion worth of capital, and Bitcoin spiking to over 10K for the first time. So again, this is me at the end of 2017, peak hype of Web3, and I'm waiting for my glorious, decentralized future. But at the same time, I think at the end of 2017, we're also seeing sort of zero consumer applications beyond accessing L1 blockchains, and I still hadn't even ridden in a self-driving car that wasn't operated by a person in the driver's seat. So that leads us to the consolidation phase, which happened after this sort of peak in 2017, where self-driving actually, it turns out, takes more capital and more time than expected. And over the course of the years after 2017, we see a huge amount of consolidation. This is Amazon buying Zoox, Apple buying Drive, GM buying Cruise, Neuro acquiring Ike, Aurora and Uber's self-driving division, and so on and so forth. And these span the spectrum from acqui-hires to, for pennies on the dollar, to strategic partnerships. But regardless, like the consolidation was very real. And meanwhile, the biggest self-driving companies just kept getting bigger, and now Waymo and Cruise, for instance, each employ over a few thousand people. Similarly, in Web3, after the ICO boom, you get a lot of over-promising and under-delivering. A lot of tokens not being tied to underlying contract utility, and ICO companies taking multiple years to deliver on their product promises, or failing to launch a product at all. So we're sort of in the trough of disillusionment. But with the consolidation, we also see massive successes emerge in the post-2017 timeframe. And this is some of our first consumer applications and protocols that have long-lasting value that are still around today and that are core parts of the Web3 ecosystem. And interestingly to know, much more than in self-driving, there is a natural path towards consolidation in Web3 that's related to network effects, where, especially for protocols, network value increases so much more with each additional participant, and the incentives around consolidation in Web3 are really quite explicit. And also, to be fair, the expansion and consolidation cycles in Web3 aren't, they're multiple cycles. Web3 is broad enough to have multiple sort of hype cycles layered on top of each other through DeFi, crypto gaming, stablecoins, DAOs, NFTs, and so on. And so it's not just sort of this one curve. So that leads us to the question, like, where in the world, like, where in this process are we in the Gartner hype cycle? Like, where in this slope of enlightenment are we right now? And there's very much this question around, like, are we there yet? For both self-driving and for Web3. And I think for self-driving, there's a valid criticism. And this is a slide I would have never been able to show had I still been working in self-driving. But the vast majority of self-driving miles are driven still with one or two operators. There have been accidents in self-driving, and I can't tell if we've saved people's lives yet. And similarly, there's some criticism in Web3, which is I'm still waiting for my glorious decentralized future, but there's actually a lot of centralization, whether this is asset ownership or along the Web3 stack, as Moxie discussed recently. But all in all, I just take it to mean that across the board, we're still in the early days, and that there is still so much more to come. And so from this shared history of boom and bust and expansion and consolidation, I think we have a lot to learn from both self-driving and from Web3. And namely, the first lesson is really one that is a takeaway for me from my experience in Web3, which is that in self-driving, we should spend more time breaking down silos. A lot of this reflection comes from why Web3 boomed. To begin with, I think the ICO boom happened because of open access to capital, and really allowing companies to be able to raise without being a part of the sort of like boys club of Silicon Valley, and being able to raise from investors who weren't just private institutional investors, but from the public and from people actively participating in those protocols and networks. I think that Web3 has lived up to its promise of interoperability, and that in Web3, by building in the open, by layering projects on top of each other and working in open source, Web3 has been able to move incredibly quickly and actually ship in a way that I think self-driving has a lot to learn from. So an open secret in self-driving is that all the stacks are more or less the same, which is the same algorithms run in the systems that are composed of more or less the same building blocks, and I've personally written the exact same geometry libraries multiple times over. So I would love to see self-driving adopt the ethos of building in the open and of sharing that we have in Web3, and I think it would lead to like faster adoption and faster progress in the self-driving space. In particular, I think that, for instance, we could do a lot better in self-driving around data sharing, which is sharing like a corpus of disengagement data, where every time a self-driving car makes a mistake on a public road and an operator has to take over. Like, I'd love to see those scenarios be shared in a corpus across companies and be used to build simulations that everybody can benefit from. But despite self-driving stacks all looking the same, I don't think that we should make them interoperable. So I'm not advocating for like a proliferation of self-driving standards that nobody uses. And this is something that's been actually a bit painful for me in Web3, where everywhere I look, there's like 18 standards that people all want me to use. So I think there's some nuance as a part of this sort of exhortation to break down silos. And on the topic of nuance, like, I get why self-driving companies want to own everything themselves. And it's because interfaces are sticky, and that it's easy to over-design interfaces prematurely. And so I think that as far as breaking down silos and sharing goes, there are things that make a lot of sense to share more of, which is research, algorithms, infrastructure, disengagement data, and so on. And places where it's less useful to break down those silos. So it's less useful to share like raw sensor data or internal module code. And in the same way, I think there's room for nuance around coordination and decentralization in Web3. The other open secret, as far as Web3 goes, is that Web3 is a lot more centralized than we want to be and than we say we are. And I think the nuance here is that the centralization, to begin with, isn't always bad by its nature. I think that coordination in decentralized structures is really important and can be a bootstrapping mechanism. So this is a sort of revision of my original lesson, which is to break down silos, but to do so in a way that's more thoughtful and nuanced. And the second lesson is to invest in tooling, which is that from self-driving, I've learned the deep importance of tooling and infrastructure. So in self-driving, we've found that in the history of consolidation, history of expansion and consolidation, the best companies, the ones that are long-lasting and still around, are the ones that, instead of trying to launch a self-driving system in just a year or two, are the ones that built for the decade. They're the ones that invested deeply in infrastructure, in tooling. They're the ones that invested in building labeling tools or data infrastructure, onboard execution infrastructure, or simulation pipelines that have proven value as a foundation for sort of this decades-long self-driving project. And I think the same lesson can be learned for Web3, which is that, like, remember, we're building for the long haul. And I think there's a perspective around long-term value for Web3 that is not to be underestimated. I think there's an opportunity here to fundamentally shift how people think about data ownership. I think there's an opportunity to invest in tooling and infrastructure for the long haul. And I also think part of building for the long haul in Web3 is focusing on usability and building better tooling for usability. Which leads me to this second point in terms of lessons around tooling, is that there's also, in the self-driving space, a lot of the companies that pushed the space forward the most were the ones that built great tools. So whether that's Scale AI, which built labeling tooling, or the various LiDAR and sensor companies, I think that the companies in the self-driving space that had really long-lasting impact were also ones that were building tools themselves. And so in Web3, I think there's similarly a really amazing opportunity to work on great tooling that powers the next generation of Web3 companies. So I'm very excited personally to be building at the infrastructure layer in Web3. So again, revisiting these lessons, I think that the takeaway from this shared history of boom and bust, of expansion and consolidation across these two industries that I've spent a lot of time in, is to break down silos and do so with nuance and do so with thought, and to invest deeply in infrastructure and in tooling. And so that's what we're doing at Privy, which is we build developer tooling that breaks down data silos. We make it easy for Web3 companies to take on sensitive user data and understand their users as more than just an on-chain address. We make it easy for users to control and share their data cross-application and cross-chain. So we're just getting started. In self-driving, I saw billions of dollars of investment lead to the training of an entire generation of roboticists that wouldn't have existed otherwise. And I'm seeing Web3 draw incredible talent in the exact same way, creating a generation of builders who think about decentralization, distributed systems, security, privacy, and more. And so I am so thrilled to be a part of this space. I think we're very much still in the early days, and there's so much more to build. Thank you.